Welcome back to the She Lives with MS podcast. I'm Michaela Michelle, and today we are talking about isolation. Isolation is invisible. Isolation is painful. And many of us that are living with MS don't know that isolation is the big elephant in the room. In today's episode, I'm going to cover the following: how isolation and loneliness show up when you're living with MS, whether it's from social withdrawal or, quote, being the sick friend, or feeling invisible, whether it is at work or at home with your family. I'll also share a little bit about what the research shows about living with isolation in multiple sclerosis. I'll also share a quick story about what came up for me in regards to feeling isolated while living with MS. And I'm also going to share about what I've learned from some of the experts who talk about the feelings of isolation and loneliness, and how social isolation is different from feeling sad or feeling depressed or feeling anxious, and how social isolation causes and actually encourages feelings of depression, anxiety, cognitive decline, and can actually trigger more symptoms within chronic illness. Lastly, I'm going to be sharing some ideas of how to reframe the isolation. And lastly, I'm going to share some tools and some practical steps for how you can deal with the feelings of isolation while living with MS. So if this speaks to you, please stay tuned. Now, the first thing that I want to do is share about what the feelings of isolation have meant for me while living with MS. In these last couple of years, I went from living with recurring, remitting multiple sclerosis, or some people call it relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis, and then my disease progression was then upgraded, unfortunately, to secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. And when that happened, it caused a storm of emotional breakdown for me. And while I was in that emotional breakdown, it caused a prolonged flare-up for me, because emotionally I was under so much pressure and felt so stressed because I went from RRMS to SPMS. And during that time, I felt so heavy. And my friends would ask me, "Are you okay?" And I would answer, "Yes." But inside, I felt like I was on an island by myself, with no one around me hearing what I was trying to say. Isolation is not depression. It's not anxiety. It's not feeling alone, and it's not loneliness. Isolation literally feels like you are living on an island, on a deserted island, by yourself, and that no one, no matter how much you scream, no matter how many times you raise your hand and say, "Help," no one is there. Why? Because no one in your life can relate to what you're going through when you're living with MS. Even your best friends cannot relate to what you're going through when living with MS. Your spouse and your family members who live in your same house cannot relate to the symptoms that you're experiencing, and the confusion and the anger and the cognitive impairment and the vertigo and the dropped foot and all the other symptoms, they cannot relate. And that feeling of no one being able to understand and relate to you causes you to feel socially, emotionally, and mentally isolated. That isolation is actually something that you must be aware of and must be able to talk about. Talk about with your family, talk about it with your therapist, and if you don't already have one, please go get one. And also explain this to your neurologist, that you also feel these feelings of isolation. And these feelings of isolation can actually cause you stress. And then that stress can cause a flare-up. The MS Society in the UK found that about 60% of people living with MS report feelings of isolation and loneliness. They call it social isolation. So imagine that you living with MS, 6 out of every 10 people living with MS report feeling socially isolated. Now, I would even wager and say that that number is even bigger than the 6 out of the 10. I feel like it would be more 8 out of 10 people with MS feel socially isolated. In an article on multiplesclerosis.net, they describe that these feelings of isolation actually make you feel invisible. And that when you live with MS, your symptoms are also invisible to those who live and interact around you. So imagine if people around you who live with you and who are friends with you or who work with you cannot visually see you going through symptoms, then everything that you're going through makes you feel invisible. And that feeling of being invisible causes and exacerbates the feelings of isolation that you feel living with MS. And then that stressed feeling of feeling invisible causes more fatigue. And then that fatigue causes more symptoms. And then those increased symptoms causes mobility issues. And then those mobility issues causes you to withdraw from friends, family, work, church, and community. Another chronic illness research paper that I'm going to put in the show notes highlights that social isolation is an under-recognized, unspoken side effect of illnesses like multiple sclerosis. Not just physical symptoms, but emotional and relational ones as well. According to therapistaid.com, loneliness is a distressing emotional response to perceived isolation. That is the key word here. Perceived isolation. Technically, we aren't completely isolated and living on an island when we live with MS. But that perceived isolation can actually trigger health risk patterns like poor sleep, ruminating negative thoughts, and low self-esteem. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to listen to my previous episode, which is episode 5, where I shared that I feel ugly living with MS. These increased health risk patterns of ruminating negative thoughts and the feelings of low self-worth, even while you're surrounded by people who love you, this needs to be spoken about, and you need to be able to verbalize the realities of this. When MS takes everything away from you, your physical abilities, it takes away spending time with people that you love and spending time with people out in the world. And it takes away stamina. And then it takes away cognitive clarity. All of the effects of MS aren't just physical. they are also relational. You know, you might still have people that are around you that love you and that are trying to be there for you. But when you feel unseen, unheard, disabled, and broken and invisible on top, that's what isolation is. And knowing that you are having these feelings of isolation, it matters, and you need to understand that this is real. So I am going to encourage you to talk about these feelings of isolation. Someone needs to stand up and help you to work through this. Again, if you haven't already hired a therapist, I could not encourage you enough. You need someone to help you talk through these feelings. I found God in this. You know, I hadn't lost God, right? God was not lost, that I needed to find him. But I found a renewed relationship with Jesus since I've been at my sickest. And the Bible reminds us, saying in Hebrews 13:5, it says, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." That's God saying, I'm never going to leave you. I know you have MS. I know you're struggling. I know you feel isolated, but you are not alone, and I will never leave your side. Because you are never truly alone when you are living with MS. I need to remind you that sometimes these feelings of isolation are perceived feelings of isolation and loneliness and feeling like you're invisible. These are perceived feelings. 9 times out of 10, they're not actually real feelings. It's because you're so underwater emotionally, or so underwater with your symptoms, or literally bugging because you can't believe that you've been diagnosed with this long-term chronic illness, that immediately that makes you feel like you are isolated and alone. But I want to remind you that you are not alone. If you've ever felt isolated, whether you've said it out loud or not, this episode was made for you. Don't stay silent in your feelings of isolation and loneliness. Share this episode with a friend who might be thinking, I'm the only one that feels this way. And if this episode resonated with you, be sure to subscribe to the She Lives with MS podcast. And also look me up on Instagram at She Lives with MS. And if you want more direction or more prayer in regards to your life with God and with Jesus Christ, please go on to my page on Instagram at Christian Spiritual Formation, where I share more about journeying through life with Jesus Christ. Lastly, if you want more resources, go to the sheliveswithms.com website and download the free resources that I have listed there on my website. Thank you for being here with me today. And I'm so sorry if you are feeling isolated while living with MS. So do I. But I will tell you that you are not alone. And you and I can do this together. Thank you for being here, and I'll speak to you on our next episode.